When we hear the word violence, we usually think of physical violence, such as a slap or a punch or some direct personal and physical damage. Violence includes both direct physical damage and a host of more subtle forms of harm. It can be degradation, humiliation, blaming, screaming, lying, cheating, withholding finances, isolating, and many more forms of violence. The key use of violence in this context is to force control over another. Domestic violence has a few different names, such as intimate partner violence, cycle of violence, and of course, domestic violence. Usually it is between adults in a family situation, but it can also include parent to child, child to parent, workplace abuse, or a member of a committee to a constituent. The common element here is the power differential. The abuser has power over the victim and seeks to control the behavior of the victim. The victim just wants the abuser to stop. Domestic violence is both simple in concept and complex in its variations. This topic can be quite triggering, so if you aren't ready for this, perhaps skip this and come back when you are. Welcome to Joshua Davidson Therapy. I am Joshua. Victims and abusers. Cyclic violence requires a victim or victims. This is one or more persons being controlled, and an abuser, sometimes called the perpetrator or perpetrator of violence, who is doing the controlling through various forms of violence. If there are only two or more victims in this conflict, then this is actually about bad communication rather than cyclic violence. While there may be a clash of cultures on what normal and should look like, it will be consistent, and so long as the people involved are reasonable, then good communication and perhaps a mediator should resolve this problem. If there are only two abusers in the relationship, there is a paucity of victims, and so the relationship will soon fall apart as neither manage to gain enough headway of control over the other. There is almost always only one abuser. However, there can be many victims. Polyamorous relationships can have multiple abusers so long as there are victims as well. Growing the cycle. This form of domestic violence runs in a cycle, repeating over time. It starts from the first time the abuser meets a potential victim, pinging them to see if they are a loving and caring person who is willing to look past minor infractions of consent or responsibility. As the potential victim continues to forgive these minor infractions, the abuser will draw them in closer and give them ever more complex reasons why their infractions should be forgiven and overlooked. Being a generous and kind person, the victim will fail to notice that these explanations become more implausible, especially when looked at all together. There are just too many benefits of the doubt that the victim will give. Entrapment. At this point, the victim has been fairly well groomed to accept violence in multiple forms, so the final test and lockdown is likely next, entrapping the victim. The abuser needs the victim to think and feel that they have to stay and have no choice but to put up with the violence. Two common methods to achieve this is the commitment trap and the unforgivable act. The commitment trap. For partners, this can be marriage, financial commitments such as the purchase of a house or business and so on, conception of a child, or moving to an isolated location such as the country or a different state or a new country. For workplace abuse, it can be giving the victim responsibility over an impossible situation with dire consequences for failure, a pay rise that depends on compliance, or some other disproportionate consequence with an absence of power to effect any change. The unforgivable act trap. Here, the abuser has pushed the victim into, or claims that the victim has committed, an unforgivable act. The abuser will then use this over the victim, either threatening to expose the victim or claiming that no one else will accept them. A false claim of a compromising situation either has nil actual evidence of wrongdoing or a vastly disproportionate claim of wrongdoing for the evidence. An example of an abusive partner's false claim is pretending that an innocuous act was cheating or assault. A possible setup for this controlling wrongdoing could be the abusive partner trying to get a friend of theirs to tempt the victim into a compromising situation. Another example is that the abuser pressuring the victim to do a bad thing. A workplace abuser's false claim is stating that they have proof that the victim has broken the law or some similar action of consequence. A setup for this can be the abuser pushing the victim to break a law for some reason and then using this to control the victim. Once the compromised situation has been fabricated or forced, the event is then used to punish and control the victim. The cycle of violence will often follow 6 basic steps. Abuse. Physical violence is more complex than direct physical damage to a person. It can also include damage to property, treasured items, and pets. Indirect physical damage is more insidious than direct physical damage. It is still very obvious that the items and pets have been damaged, but it's hard to prove. Even so, many victims will downplay these obvious signs because the cost of leaving seems too high. Violence, however, is about any kind of aggressive action, whether it is physical, as we just described, or cognitive, fundamental principles, emotional, social, financial, belief, or a host of others. The common element is that the victim feels awful, such that they want to change their behavior to suit the rules of the abuser of the moment. It is important to differentiate between a rational discussion and an abusive discussion. A rational discussion outlines harm and a reasonable pathway to mutual benefit. An abusive discussion is controlling and requires someone to change solely for the benefit of the other, and where that required change is frequently unreasonable or meets a rule that is likely to change when the abuser is next violent. A perpetrator of abuse will use one of these violent methods to enforce some kind of control or change over the victim. Blame. Once the violence has been enacted, the abuser will not take any serious responsibility for their actions. It will always be someone else's fault. Perhaps it was work was too hard, or the way the abuser's parents did that thing, or some other excuse. The majority of the time, though, the blame for the action will be attributed to the victim. Common phrases are, "Look what you made me do," or "I wouldn't have had to do this to you if you had just done what I asked," or "What are you talking about? I never did anything." The blame phase is usually where the gaslighting starts. Gaslighting is about convincing someone that reality is different to what they thought, and that the victim of gaslighting is crazy, toxic, or the real abuser. It's about turning fiction into fact and fact into fiction. The goal of the abuser is to convince the victim that the victim is to blame for the actions taken against them, regardless of the reality of the situation. Groomed victims are used to accepting blame instead of questioning it. Pursuit. Now that the violence has been committed and the abuser has tricked the victim into accepting that it isn't the abuser's fault, they now have to groom the victim into staying. This is commonly done through 4 techniques. Hollow words. Words that make emotional sense to you but have a hollow meaning to them, such as, "But I love you," or "You know I don't mean it." False promises. These are claims of future action that just never seem to come to any change in the abuse stage, such as, "I'll never do this again," or "I'll go and get some help, counseling or therapy," or "I'll promise I'll do better." Empty gestures. Actions such as cuddling, massage, walks, and so on, or gifts like flowers, chocolates, a new phone, or any gift to get your forgiveness. These empty gestures trick you into thinking they have learned from their actions, but in reality, this is just a distraction, and a way of purchasing your forgiveness. Crocodile tears, either a feigned or even real upset the abuser displays around the abuse. This distracts the giving and nurturing victim from the fact that the abuser just did bad stuff and switches the victim's gear from reconciling what has just happened to heal and help another. Effectively, the abuser is saying, I'm so emotionally upset that you are hurt that I need comfort. When the real reason why the victim is hurt is because the abuser hurt them. The pursuit phase is all about purchasing forgiveness or distracting the victim from examining the abuse and the blame. Once the victim has suitably accepted this, the cycle progresses. Honeymoon. The abuser does not dare abuse too rapidly, or they risk losing control over the victim as they seek escape. Following the success of the pursuit phase, the abuser will switch to being charming and nice. Unlike the charm of the original courtship, though, the honeymoon charm is often tinged with an edge of nastiness. Effectively, the abuser is lying about being nice, but it is a weak performance. The victim is also lying in this phase. They are pretending that this honeymoon is real, that the nightmare is over, and finally they are getting somewhere. By accepting the pursuit phase, the victim has invested in one more time, and this time we'll get it right. It'll be different. Yet the victim knows that this is not real and will pretend extra hard that the nasty edge of the abuser isn't there. When the victim accepts the weak performance of being nice, the abuser knows that the victim has accepted the pursuit phase and that they are safe to start building up again. Tension. Lying is hard. It is exhausting. The abuser will begin to weaken their already weak performance of niceness, and more cutting remarks and more judgment and more signs of violence and controlling behaviours will start to manifest. New or strong victims are reluctant to accept this nastiness and will sometimes react with sass, mouthiness, or even physical affront. The abuser has frequently convinced the victim that this is what causes the violence in the first place, so will reinforce the earlier gaslighting. Long-term victims will often be passive and weary at this point. The tension stage will often last a while. As the abuser is often charming and nice around others, the victim may attempt to use social situations to stay in the honeymoon stage. Unfortunately, this doesn't actually work very well. Threat. As the tension phase approaches a crescendo, the victim is walking on eggshells, trying not to trigger the attack that is inevitable. The victim will start to look for signs that the abuser is going to do the bad stuff again, so that they can brace for the horrible things that they know are coming. The abuser has lost their charm and the threats are no longer subtle. Abuse is coming, and anticipating it is awful. And there is nothing that the victim can do to stop the abuser from entering the abuse stage, because the abuser is the only one who can actually stop this. In desperation, some victims have discovered pushing the button. Pushing the button. Bonus round. Let us say that Mother's Day is tomorrow and we are in the threat stage today. Having the abuser be awful when Mother is around is embarrassing and awkward and only reinforces what Mother always says. It would be really nice if everything got moved along to the honeymoon stage tomorrow. So rather than wait for the abuser to break at an inconvenient time, the victim will push the button. This will be something that triggers the abuser to do the abusive act. This same button will do nothing to anyone else who isn't abusive. Reasonable and kind people are not so easily pushed into abuse. Now, don't get me wrong, We all have limits, and eventually anyone can be tricked into violence. The big difference here is that the abuser is easy to push. A key phrase here, a facial expression there, and boom! The victim feels like they are in control because they knew the violence was coming and so were braced. The abuser loves this. They can act all hurt and abused, blaming the victim for pushing the button. And the illusion is that the victim made the abuser violent. The violence was coming regardless. The abuser was always going to blame the violence on something petty and was always going to make it the victim's fault. However, this pushing the button can make it very confusing to know who is the abuser and who is the victim. Actually, it isn't hard. 3 questions usually clear this up. Who is making change to stop this cycle? Who is using the aggression to control the other? Who is actually scared to misbehave? Is there any way to actually stay together? It only takes one person to be an abuser in a relationship, which will make it bad. It takes all the people to work together to make it good. A signature part of the cycle of violence is that the abuser won't accept responsibility for harming the victim, except perhaps in the pursuit phase. This makes it very difficult for this abusive person to change. If the perpetrator of abuse has woken up to their part in the problem, then there is a chance that with some good therapy, they can change their ways. It will take about a year for the person to change their habits from destructive to constructive. A key part of this is to get a proper assessment to ensure that there are not other diagnostic features that have been missed. A regular counsellor or relationship therapist may not be enough for subtle undiagnosed traits. If there is an undiagnosed condition, this can then be directly treated as well as the person learning how to do better in relationships. The victim will also need to work on not triggering or perpetuating the cycle. Our next session will go over some of the consequences to victims who have broken the cycle. It is important to note that if the perpetrator cannot acknowledge their part in the damage, then they will not change. They cannot be saved. The victim can choose to accept this and stay, or can attempt to find ways to dampen the violence within the relationship. It is not very good for the victim, and the caution that I would give the person who chooses this path is, what are you modeling for your children? You cannot help an unwilling person. If the abuser won't accept their part in the violence, then the best option you have is to leave. If the abuser is a dependent of yours, then this may be very difficult to achieve. Either way, seek out a therapist who is versed in domestic violence. Unfortunately, too few therapists have the necessary training for this. So if they don't know the contents of this in some format, then move on to someone who does. Thank you for your time.